So let's talk about percentages. The first thing we need to talk about is there are three categories of problems with regards to percents. The first category is when we're asked to find a given percent of a number. So for example, imagine if somebody were to ask, what is 10%? So what is 10% of 10? So 10% of 10, as you would recognize, is 1, which can be solved out to be 10 over 100, right? That's the part for the percent, times 10, which will equal 1. Well, let's go ahead and solve this and see how we get 1. 10 divided by 100, again representing the 10%, times 10 over 1. We're going to use fraction multiplication. So fraction multiplication. Remember, with fraction multiplication, you do not have to have a common denominator. All you need is you can multiply the numerators together and the denominators together. Now, as we get more comfortable with numbers and simplifying numbers, we know that we don't have to always multiply them out and then simplify. We can actually simplify first and then multiply. That's something that we will see as we work with fractions more and more. But let's just go ahead and multiply the numerators together. So 10 times 10, of course, is 100. And 100 times 1 is 100. Any number divided by itself is 1. And so we've just solved mathematically or algebraically, what is 10% of 10. So we can use fraction multiplication, and this is the first category. When they ask us what is a certain percent of a number. Let's look at another example. Think about it this way. What is 50%? So what is 50% of, 20? Now, you already know that 50% is associated with half, right? So if we were to convert a percent to a fraction, we know that 50% is half, or in a decimal form, it would be 0.5. So you have percent, fraction, and decimal. So notice you can take the 50%, write it as 50 over 100, and then you simplify it to its lowest terms. So you divide the 50 by 50, you divide the 100 by 50, you get 1/2. So you can convert from percents to fractions by simplifying the percent to the simplest form of a fraction, or in a fraction. So it'll become the simplest form. That's how we convert it there. When we want to convert to decimals, if it's divided by 100, like 50 over 100, we just move the decimal place twice to the left, which becomes 0.5. Or we use long division, which is where we'll put the 100 outside and we'll put the 50 inside. We're not going to go into this part in this video, but what I'm trying to say is we need to be comfortable with converting from percents to fractions and percents to decimals, and converting from decimals to fractions and decimals to percent. So it's a good skill to have, knowing how to convert from one form to the other. 50% of 20 would simply be writing the 50 over 100 as we've done before. Remember, whenever it says something percent, like 20% would be 20 over 100. 10% would be 10 over 100. So 50% of 20 would be 50 over 100 times 20 over 1. Notice I put the number 20 over 1 because any number divided by 1 is itself, it remains the same, right? It's the identity property, essentially, of multiplication. Well, actually, the identity property of multiplication, you multiply a number by 1 and you get the same number. But think of it in a similar manner with division. Any number divided by 1 is just that number, right? It stays the same. But so we have 50 over 100 times 20 over 1. If we were to multiply this across, we would get 50 times 20, and then on the bottom we'll have 100 times 1. So you have 100 on the bottom, and on the top you would have 1,000. In math, you are allowed to do this. You're allowed to cancel out those zeros. They're the same. Those zeros can also go away. They're the same thing. You don't do this for other numbers, though. If you had 21 divided by 121, you can't cancel the ones. So this only works here with the zeros. Now, when you cancel this 0 and this 0, you're left with 10. So the answer is 10. 50% of 20 is 10, but we've also shown how that can be done. That is very important to note. It is important to show how you can do it mathematically and using arithmetic. The reason why this is important is because you will not always have well situated percent. So, for example, what if somebody says, "What is 37% of a number, or what is what is a percent that will not come out neatly like we have here, right? So we're looking for 37% of a number. If we're looking for 37% of 17, for example, well, this is not going to work out nicely like the one we had above. We would multiply the 37 times 17, that's fine, and then we would just divide that by 100. Now, 37 times 17 is 629. We divide that by 100. In this case, you actually move the decimal place to the left 2 times, and the answer is 6.29. But the reason what I was trying to show us is that we will not always be able to cancel the numbers, right? Like in this case with the zeros, you can, but some cases you will not. And so just keep that in mind. So the first category with working with percents is knowing how to find what is 5% of 5. We say 5 over 100 times 5. That's 5% of 5. That's very important to remember, that we write the percent part as like 5 over 100, and then we multiply by 5. We can use fraction multiplication, so that's what we need, is fraction multiplication. If we have any issues or concerns with this step, it'll be a good time to review fraction multiplication. So that's something I would recommend. Math is like a house. Remember, you build the foundation and then you build the next level. So whenever you find that you might be questioning a certain concept, check the prerequisites or the things before what you're working on and strengthen them. If you strengthen them, then the house will be solid, right? So the house will be solid. Okay, so 5% of 5, we have 5 over 100 times 5 over 1. This is technically 25 over 100. And then this is, you can move the decimal over 2 times, so 0.25. Or if you want to write it as a fraction, it's 1 over 4. Okay, very good. The second and third category, I'll just mention it now, and then we'll do them in a different video. The second category is when you're asked to find a percent given two numbers. So for example, 15, okay, actually let's do 10 is what percent of 50? So 10 is what percent of 50? That's another form that you might get these questions. If somebody says 10 is what percent of 50, right? So if I give you a certain number, right? This is 50, and I give you another number and I say 10 is what percent of 50, right? So basically with this one again, 10 is what percent of 50. Think about it. Think about percents like this, okay? Let's start with the default setting. Remember the first category we said when we say what is 10% of 50? Let's use that for example. Technically what you do is you write the percent part, right? You multiply it by a certain number. Let's call that number, let's see, we're going to call that number W. And that equals a certain number, a certain part, we call it, right? Actually, this is perfect, whole and part. So 10% of a whole gives us a part. Okay, so remember the places. So we can actually write it like this. We have percent, we have whole, and we have part. Okay, so think of it this way. If I said 10% of 50, right? Notice the whole is 50. And when you actually solve this out, which now I'm going to show you one way you can do this quickly, you can cancel the zeros. Notice the answer is 5. So 10% of 50 is 5. Now, this was the percent part of the problem. This was the whole, and this was the part. Here's what it really comes down to. There are times when we will not give you the percent, right? We will give you the whole and the part. There are times when we will not give you the whole. We will give you the percent and the part. And there are times where we'll give you the part and you can basically find it. We'll give you the part and the whole, and then you would have to find the percent. So there's 3 different things. There's percent, right? There's whole, and there's part. Just remember those 3 things: percent, whole, and part. Sometimes we'll ask you to find the percent. Sometimes we'll ask you to find the whole. Sometimes we'll ask you to find the part. But if you remember the formula, almost like let's write it like this. So you have a percent times a whole is equal to the part, right? And let's use a letter for percent here and part, right? So let's use the letter so that they are very distinguished very well. Let's use the letter V. Okay, V times W is equal to P. P is for part, and this is like V is representing percent, and this is the whole. But before we move forward, I want to teach something briefly called one-step equations. This is just a quick commercial for a second. One-step equations are equations that require one step in order to be solved. An equation can simply be a situation where you have A times B is equal to C. If I ask you to solve for A, all you do is divide both sides by B, and the answer is A is equal to C over B. And actually, there's a better example of one-step equations. Distance is equal to speed times time, or rate times time. So if somebody were to ask you to find the time it will take you to get to a certain city, and they give you the distance and they give you the rate, so let's say you're going from a city in Duluth, Minnesota to Minneapolis, Minnesota. Let's say the distance is 120 miles, and let's say you're going to travel 60 miles per hour. And you're traveling 60 miles per hour because maybe your tires are bad, because you technically could go 70. That's the speed limit. But let's say you just have to go 60 miles per hour. It makes our equation simple to work with. And we want to find the time. We divide both sides by 60 in this case, and the time is actually 2 hours. That's the time it will take you to get to Minneapolis, or a city near Minneapolis, which is 120 miles away from Duluth. So the main point here is one-step equations involve dividing both sides by whatever you do to the right side, you have to do to the left side. This idea of one-step equations can be used in solving the percent problems. So let me wrap up with this. Remember, as I said, there's 3 categories. They can ask you to find the percent, they can ask you to find the part, and they can ask you to find the whole. So I know I was just going to introduce category 2 and 3. So let's wrap up with that. Category 1 is what is 10% of 50. In this first category, we're looking for a part, right? In the second category, we can say you get 2 numbers, right? And you're trying to find, so I give you 2 numbers and I want to know the relationship between them. I am solving for the percent. And in the third category, I can say find a number that is a given percent of another number. For example, 10% of what number is 12? So we can be given the part and percent, and guess what we're looking for? We're looking for the whole. So the 3 categories, again, we have a percent. We're going to call it V for a second, or let's just write it out. Percent times, so the percent times the whole will equal the part. We're using a dot to represent multiplication, but we can write it out like that, okay? So percent times whole. So let's write that down. Percent times whole is equal to part. If you remember this and you remember one-step equations, so whenever we're solving for percents, we basically divide both sides by the whole, right? Let's write this out, and then we'll end with that screen. Percent times whole is equal to part. So whenever they ask us to solve for let's say they are solving for a percent, we don't know what the percent is. We basically divide both sides by the whole, right? So that will give us the percent value. The part divided by the whole, right, will give us the percent. Now, granted, you multiply that by 100% to get it in a percentage form. The other one you look at is if they ask you to find the whole and they give you the percent and the part, you will divide both sides. So this is one category. Another category is where you are dividing both sides. So you have percent times whole is equal to part. So if I'm looking for the whole, I'll divide both sides by the percent that I'm giving. So let's try this one quickly. So if somebody says 10% of what number is 20? So 10% of what number, so times the whole, is equal to, they said 10% of what number is 20. That means I need to divide both sides by 10% technically, right? Which is actually technically 20 divided by, now 10% can be written as 0.10. For simplicity, we'll just use a calculator for now. We're going to actually dissect this more later because 10% is the same thing as 0.10. But the answer in this case is 200, right? So if I say 10% of what number is 20, the answer is 200. That's the whole. And the third category is when I ask, so I give you percent, whole, and part, right? If you're just looking for the part, then you just multiply whatever percent you were given by the whole. That's the question, like what is 25% of 640? That's using the third category. Now, I know there's a lot to go through here. I just wanted to sort of lay the groundwork with percentages. There are three types of problems. They have to do with the percents, whole, and part. And we see percentages all over the place. Discounts when you go to the store. You go to the store and they say 50% off. One that is very common even in the, you look at different situations. You have discounts and commissions. People who work certain jobs get a certain commission. 10% is a very common one. If you've heard what a tithe is, a tithe that is spoken of in the Old Testament in the Bible, that's 10%. So, and is also discussed, of course, in other parts, not just in the Old Testament, but it's that percent. You might have heard of 10%, or some people agree when they have certain contracts that I'll get certain percent of, so percentages are very useful in the real world. So make sure that you keep that in mind. There are many applications, and all the best as you keep learning percents. We'll look at more aspects of the second and third category in a different video. Have a wonderful day.